This question is from an anonymous listener who asks, do English people realise how crazy the hotel protests look to those of us in Scotland? Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson are doing more to enable Scottish independence than anyone else. I'm not sure if this question is necessarily that accurate, because we have seen protests held outside asylum hotels in Scotland, in Perth, Aberdeenshire and Falkirk lately, and they are, causing concern to Scottish councils and Scottish politicians as well.
Yes, so I mean that's just one example of where there's often less of a divide between Scotland and England than some suggest in terms of political attitudes. It is a divide that obviously the SNP likes to talk up, because they do want to create this sense that Scotland is a fundamentally different country that should be independent. I mean, and one example of where the two countries are aligned is reform's rise. The reform aren't just on the rise in England; they're on the rise in Scotland. They've been touching 20% in some polls, in second place. They've now got their first MSP after a Tory defection. And I think in Scotland, the view is Nigel Farage is appealing to an anti-establishment sort of FU votes that maybe used to go to the SNP, but in some cases is now shifting, the disillusioned after 4 terms of SNP governments. And after all, 38% of Scots voted leave, voted for Brexit. So the idea that Farage has no appeal in Scotland is clearly wrong. But in terms of what's driving independence, attitudes are in some ways remarkably little changed since that referendum period. They're still broadly neck and neck. And that hasn't changed too much, even as the SNP's fortunes have ebbed and flowed. I think the biggest challenge at the moment for Unionists is Labour's unpopularity. So Scottish Labour leader Anna Sarwar did an interview with the New Statesman start of 2024 with our Scotland editor Chris Deerin, and a line that stuck in my mind at the time was he said, "I can't afford an unpopular Labour government," by which he meant if Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister, I need them to keep up popularity, because I'm facing my own tests, the Scottish Parliament elections in May 2026. At the moment, the SNP now enjoy a double-digit lead over Labour again. And if they win a 5th term, then that clearly has the potential to put the independence question back on the table.
Yes, and I think the politics of the populist right is of concern to SNP politicians. I spoke to Hamza Yousaf, the former First Minister, earlier this week on the podcast, and our conversation suggested that there is a great deal of concern about protests outside asylum hotels, misinformation spread about asylum seekers, this case of a child in Dundee wielding weapons, which was, spread as misinformation around asylum seekers by Elon Musk. That was something of concern to him. And he even suggested that he didn't feel that his children were safe in Scotland in this atmosphere. So it certainly is a concern north of the border as it is in England. And I do want to discuss more broadly the latest reform policy that's been announced with you, George, because we haven't actually had a chat about that on the podcast yet. This idea of mass deportations. I mean, how closely has the Labour government been following the unveiling of this policy, and how much does it concern them?
Well, look, reform in general is clearly a huge political challenge to the government. They've now got a 10-point lead in the polls, and you've seen a very clear trend where as reform have risen in popularity, immigration has risen to the top in some polls of voters' priorities. And combined with the asylum hotel protests, combined with the rise in small boat crossings, which have reached a record 50,000 over the last year, I think for the government, being seen to have a grip, particularly on illegal immigration, is going to be a huge challenge. And that's why they're trying to accelerate moves to close down asylum hotels. They're trying to speed up deportations, because I think that's really the most politically salient area, that legal immigration, most voters think it's been too high, but are more relaxed about it. And of course, we are seeing net migration plummet from the highs it reached under Boris Johnson.
And in your view, do you think they've exploited enough the things in Farage's plan that actually are quite distasteful to the public? Deporting children back to dangerous countries, paying the Taliban to take Afghan refugees back. I mean, have they made the most of those, potentially, quite fruitful attack lines?
I mean, some in Labour would argue not. I think they are trying to portray Farage as someone who's offering sort of false solutions, and they were pleased that he was seen to U-turn and say, "Look, I wasn't talking about women and children," and casting him as someone who is, you know, a snake oil salesman, but who doesn't actually have a plan that works. There are some progressives, though, who would argue they need to make a more sort of full frontal challenge to Nigel Farage, which I think the government would argue you did see over the European Convention on Human Rights, which not just Farage, but David Blunkett, former Home Secretary, has called for the temporary suspension of. And they've essentially said, backed Matthew Pennycook, the housing minister, who said that this will put us in a club with Russia and Belarus, and we're not going to undermine the Good Friday Agreement. So that there is a clear red line between Labour and Reform. But then there's some in Labour who think if the review going on of elements of the ECHR doesn't lead to enough change, then maybe we will need to consider temporary suspension. That's how worried some Labour MPs are about the political challenge of immigration.